Hey, Jason.
Hey, you want to hear me?
Yeah, there we go.
It's better if you don't hear me because all I'm doing is choking over here. And
Well, then in that case, yeah, just go back to mute.
all right. So we're gonna talk about the supported authentication services. You can just catch up. You'll be all right. So the Palo Alto software supports two different authentication services. It can either do XML based with user one password, or it can have a user database that's stored in there. Again, these are local authentication services that are built into the Palo Alto firewall. Other users may use other authentication profiles that go out to other services. So as I mentioned on the last slide, you could hear me. We talked about a user database as well as a Kerberos server, an LDAP, Radius, TACX, and you could even use SAML authentication over here as well. So there's 5 external services offered within a Palo Alto. 4 of those have multi-factor authentications, which are not shown. They're described in a later chapter or a later portion of this. So how are users authenticating or connecting through the firewall? So far, we've worked with the management interface through HTTPS. You would also have things like the XML API you could send through, the command line interface, as well as the serial console. And when those users are connecting to resources inside of there, such as the website, webmail, SharePoint, Office 365, those can also require user authentication in order to go through the firewall itself. So the ones on the left are connecting to go to the firewall. The ones on the right are to connect to go through the firewall. As far as the method of authentication, this is the default here. So you pre-configure a user to log in, for example, Mary. She's going to log in and they're going to use some kind of authentication profile. In this case, it's either going to be local or an external authentication service, for example, LDAP, and we can mark that profile against her. We can also set up things like a Radius server, in which case we would have a Radius authentication and as well as TACAX and SAML. And like you said, there was 5 external services. So when Mary sends in a web request, we take a look at the firewall, we match a rule. If we find out that it is matched to a web form using LDAP, that we're going to go ahead and send that authentication from the firewall, override that, and send that out to the LDAP service. So that's pretty slick. User authentication to and through the firewall, they're basically reiterating the same thing. The only difference here is that you can see down below is that we have to configure user IDs, and we'll talk about user IDs a little bit later when we talk about different ways to filter within a Palo Alto firewall. But it's handy if you match this up from the very beginning. So authentication to access network resources through the firewall can also be set by a security policy. Such a security policy is this one down here. So if the user is part of the marketing group, they would be allowed access to Facebook. All right. There is new capabilities being added to the Palo Alto software. For example, this stuff did not exist, but you have these default password profiles, for example, super users that are read-only or device administrators and their read-only counterparts. This is where you can set up custom role-based admins, so you can fine-tune what they're actually going to be able to adjust and not adjust. So say you have a junior administrator that's wanting to authenticate things through the web UI or through the XML. Maybe he's using the REST API with some kind of Python scripting in order to configure the firewall. But their job is to set up a role-based or a set up policies. And so we're going to define what objects they would have access to based on that particular role. In this case, they're describing like a policy admin. Okay, so if we create a local non-database administrator account, which means it's just being stored on the firewall, typically in XML, we would bring that in with the name, and then they're required to have a password. That password we could set up over here and do different roles or profiles, and that way we could assign those user to specific profiles, which makes it a little easier. You set up one. If you got to add 5 junior administrators in order that are going to go in and deal with security policies, that you could set up a profile to match all 5 of those to the same roles. Create that user, you set up a password. You could also pass in a hash if you wanted to. When you do a password, you are typing the clear text down below here. And also as a local user, you could pass in the password hash that you want to use. That's new. They didn't have a way for you to do hashes before that I remember. So another way to do it is to create a local database authentication profile, which is just using a local database on the system. You can set it to local database instead of none. And this is going to allow you to authenticate against a database running on the Palo Alto firewall. You can also define users as well as who would be part of the profile. So when we're dealing with an authentication profile, again, most of the things that you'll start to see in the Palo Alto, they have a lot of profiles, meaning that if you're doing this 10 times, it's easier to create one profile once and then just assign people to that profile. You can set up things like account lockout. For example, if they try to log in more than 3 times and fail, they get locked out for 10 minutes. That's good in order to thwart brute force attacks in there as well. So if you lock them out for a day or something ridiculous, that would keep people from trying to attack the system. All right. Creating that non-local administrator account. This is going to be like something on an LDAP. Again, LDAP, Radius, TACAX, those are all authentication services that are pretty common in the networking side. Which one you use depends on the devices that you have connecting to it. So LDAP is pretty universal. You can kind of think of it as a generic way of doing like a Windows Active Directory. But LDAP works across Linux servers and a bunch of other services utilize an LDAP base. When we work with authentication profiles, we'll authenticate with a non-local password. We'll read the optional sequence, go to the first authentication profile. If we match it, great. If it does, then is the account found? Yes, then we can go ahead and just check it. Simple flow chart on how we use non-local passwords. For setting up an LDAP server, which you guys will do in some of the labs, you'll set up a profile to connect to that LDAP server. You'll pass in the IP address information and the port numbers it's running on. You'll need to have the basic LDAP information, for example, the DCs, whether they're lab or local, and you'll have to have the connection names of admin and the data centers that are associated with that. And then you can set up the password for them to connect to the server itself. These are going to be the server profiles. Again, just showing you that you can connect via LDAP or Radius authentication. You can also do multiple systems. So if you put them in a sequence, you could check against the LDAP server first. If they're not in the LDAP server, you could check against the Radius system to see if they're in there, and you can adjust that sequence order as well. Then last but not least, we're going to deal with how we deal with passwords. So in a password authentication from an interactive side, this is you logging into the web interface, for example, getting access to the dashboard. We can also do certificate-based authentication, meaning that you must have a certificate on your system in order to connect to the firewall and go out. So obviously this bottom one is in a way more secure because you have to have that certificate in order to connect out to the system. So you can't just log in from your phone or from your laptop or something else. It must have that certificate present on the device. Those certificates, when they're generated, are going to prove the identity. You can see where they're issued. We're going to have a whole section where we talk about what certificates are and how to use them, how to generate them, that kind of thing. Again, they have a profile. So if you set up a web UI client certificate and you match to the certificate that's in here, then each user could download that certificate to their PC, set it up in their certificates on that PC so that they can authenticate straight through. So again, you can use that certificate for authentication via the web. You could also use it for SSH access and assign what type of role or users that they would have profile against. So fairly straightforward. There is going to be a lab that we'll cover on Thursday. I believe this one I'm just going to let you guys do because it's pretty straightforward, to be honest. So we won't record or do anything like that for Thursday's just go ahead and jump in the lab this week and set up authentication. You're going to come in as remote different users. You'll set up authentication out to a Radius server that's on the setup, as well as an LDAP system. So, all right.